Welcome back to Haunted Horizons. Tonight, we bring you a story that will make you question reality itself. The House That Calls Your Name, a terrifying journey into the unknown, where a voice whispers in the dark, and mirrors hold more than just reflections. What happens when a house doesn't just haunt you, but wants you? Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare for a night of fear. Are you ready? Let's begin. Part 1. The Echoing Voice. Michael Carter never believed in ghosts. He always laughed off horror stories, dismissed shadows as tricks of the light, and waved away whispers as the wind's games. But all of that changed the night he first heard his name. It started subtly. A whisper, too quiet to be sure. He had been walking home late from a friend's house, his boots crunching against the damp autumn leaves. The streets were empty, his town swallowed by silence. Then, Michael. His breath hitched, but when he spun around, there was no one. Just an endless stretch of houses, all dark, all sleeping. He shook his head and kept walking. Trick of the mind. Fatigue. Nothing more. But then he passed that house, the one that had been abandoned for years, the one the kids whispered about in school but never dared approach. A decrepit Victorian, its windows like dark, hollow eyes staring into the night. The door was slightly ajar, swaying with the breeze. And then he heard it again. Michael. The voice came from inside. His blood turned to ice. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was his voice. Michael took a slow step backward, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Every rational thought told him to walk away, to run. But something rooted him in place, something deep, primal. Then a light flickered on inside the house. A dim glow spilled out from the cracked doorway, stretching across the porch like fingers reaching for him. His legs moved on their own, step by step, drawn in by some unseen force. He stood at the threshold now. The air inside smelled of dust and something else. Something damp, rotting. His breath trembled as he peeked through the opening. The hallway was lined with old furniture, draped in sheets, but the mirrors lining the walls weren't covered. And in the nearest mirror, he saw himself standing in the hallway. But he wasn't inside. He was still on the porch. So how? Then the reflection moved. Michael hadn't moved. He had barely breathed. But his reflection tilted its head, staring at him. The light above flickered, And then, from the depths of the house, that voice called again. "Michael, come in." His own voice. Michael's knees nearly buckled. His mind screamed, "No." His heart pounded, "Run." But his feet refused to obey. His reflection lifted a hand, not a mirror image, a second him. "Come in," it repeated, but its lips didn't move. The words crawled from somewhere deeper, inside the walls, inside the house. Then another sound. Footsteps upstairs. Michael's stomach twisted. There shouldn't have been footsteps. This house was abandoned. But something was up there, and it was walking toward the staircase. His reflection's lips curled into a smile. Not his smile, too wide, too wrong. Michael stumbled back, shaking his head. "This isn't real," he muttered. "This isn't real." Something touched his shoulder. He spun around, fists clenched. But there was nothing, just empty air. Then the lights inside the house died all at once. Total darkness swallowed everything, and Michael's breath hitched. The night was too silent now, like the world itself had been muted. But the whisper wasn't gone. It was behind him now, right behind him. "Michael, don't go." He felt a cold breath against his ear. Michael ran. He didn't stop running until he was inside his house, bolting the door behind him. His lungs burned. His legs ached. He forced deep breaths, trying to steady himself. It was fine. He was fine. It was just a trick of exhaustion, a hallucination. His phone buzzed. He fumbled it out of his pocket, barely able to hold it with shaking fingers. A message from his best friend, Kevin. "Kevin, dude, where did you go? Thought you were right behind me." Michael frowned. What? He had walked home alone. His stomach twisted as another message popped up. "Kevin, you left your jacket at my place. Want me to drop it off?" Michael's heart stopped. His jacket was hanging on the chair, right in front of him. Then a faint tap on the window. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He turned, and there he was, Michael, standing in his backyard, smiling. Part 2, Reflections in the Dark. Michael froze. The figure in the backyard was identical to him in every way, except for the eyes. They were too dark, too deep, like twin voids swallowing the faint glow of the streetlights. His pulse pounded. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused. Then the other Michael moved. It lifted a hand, slowly, deliberately, then pointed at him. The room's temperature dropped. Frost crept along the window pane. A whisper curled into Michael's ear, low and guttural. "Let me in." Michael stumbled back. This wasn't real. He squeezed his eyes shut, counting to 3. When he looked again, the figure was gone, but the whisper remained. He heard it inside his head now, like something was crawling inside his thoughts. His phone buzzed again. Unknown. Number. Open the door. Michael's stomach clenched. His hands trembled as he gripped his phone. He didn't respond. He wouldn't. But the next message made his blood run cold. Unknown number. I'm already inside. His bedroom door creaked open. Michael turned just in time to see the figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't outside anymore. It was here. The air in the room thickened, pressing against Michael's chest. His lungs struggled to pull in breath. The figure stepped forward, silent, its movements fluid and unnatural. Not human. Michael stumbled backward, his heel catching on the rug. He hit the ground hard, pain jolting up his spine. Move! Get up! The figure knelt beside him. Its face was his, but the skin was wrong. Too smooth, too pale, like a mask stretched over something else. It leaned in, its lips barely parting, as it whispered, "You're not supposed to be here." The world blurred. Darkness swallowed the walls. Michael tried to scream, but no sound came. Then everything went black. Part 3. The Shattered Reflection. Michael tried to move, but his body felt like lead. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, slow and deliberate, its smile stretching unnaturally wide. "You don't belong here," it whispered, but its lips never moved. The voice came from inside his head. Michael's breath came in ragged gasps. He scrambled backward, pressing against the farthest wall. This can't be real. The figure took another step, then another. Its bare feet didn't make a sound against the hardwood floor. Michael's shaking hands fumbled for anything. A weapon, a phone, a way out. His fingers closed around the bedside lamp. In a desperate burst of adrenaline, he swung it with all his strength. The lamp shattered against the figure's head, but it didn't flinch. Instead, something horrifying happened. Cracks spread across its face, like broken porcelain. Beneath the surface, something moved. Michael's stomach twisted as the skin peeled away, revealing something writhing beneath. A swirling, inky void where a human face should have been. And then the whispers exploded. Thousands of voices layered on top of each other, screaming his name, calling to him, pulling him down. Michael clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside him. He could feel it crawling into his bones, his thoughts being rewritten. The walls around him warped, stretching into impossible angles. Shadows slithered across the ceiling, whispering secrets he wasn't meant to hear. Then the mirrors shattered. Every single mirror in the room exploded outward, shards flying in all directions. The pieces hung in the air, suspended, reflecting impossible images. In one, he saw himself running. In another, he saw himself grinning like the figure before him. And in the largest mirror, he saw himself standing behind himself. Michael screamed. He turned, but it was too late. The other him grabbed his wrist, and the world collapsed into darkness. Michael woke up on the floor, gasping for breath. His head throbbed, his limbs ached. The room was silent, but something was different. He sat up slowly, his eyes darting to the mirror across from him. It was whole again, but his reflection wasn't moving. Michael's blood ran cold. He raised a hand. The reflection did not. Instead, it smiled. And then, from deep within the mirror, the whisper returned. "You should have let me in." Part 4, The Other Side. Michael woke up gasping, but something was wrong. The room was identical to his, but not. The walls stretched slightly too tall. The furniture looked untouched, and the air was too still, like a perfect copy that wasn't quite right. Then, a voice. "Welcome home." Michael spun around. There, standing in the mirror, was himself. But this version of him wasn't trying to escape. It was watching, smiling. The whispers began again, crawling through the air, seeping into his skin. The floor rippled under his feet, shadows slithering up the walls, and as Michael backed away, his reflection stepped forward, out of the mirror, into the room. "You should have let me in," the other Michael whispered. Michael screamed. Part 5. The Inescapable Loop. Michael stumbled backward, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The other Michael, the reflection that wasn't a reflection, took another step forward. "It's time," the other Michael whispered, tilting its head unnaturally. "Time to take your place." The walls shifted, stretching taller, the shadows deepening. Michael turned, running for the door, but it wasn't there anymore. Instead, only more mirrors, each one showing him in a different state. Some terrified, some smiling, some watching. He spun to face the other Michael, but he was gone. Instead, the whispers swarmed around him, the voices multiplying, crawling under his skin. A cold, clawed hand brushed against his shoulder. And then the lights went out. Part 6. The Fractured Reality. The darkness swallowed Michael whole. He tried to move, but the air was thick, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. His breath came in ragged gasps as the whispers wrapped around him, slithering into his ears. Then, light, flickering, dim, like a dying candle. The walls materialized around him, but they weren't the same. The wallpaper pulsed, the floor stretched like melting wax. The house had shifted. He turned, and his stomach dropped. Mirrors, hundreds of them, all around him, stretching into eternity, each reflecting a different version of himself. Some were normal, some were not. In one, he was smiling too wide, his eyes hollow voids. In another, his skin was peeling, revealing something dark beneath. And in the largest mirror, directly ahead, his reflection wasn't standing still. It was walking toward him. Michael stumbled back, his heart hammering. The figure inside the glass pressed its hands against the surface, its mouth moving without sound. Then, a single word pierced his skull. "Let me out." The mirrors shattered. A wind howled through the house, carrying screams that didn't belong to him. The shards didn't fall, but floated, suspended mid-air, reflecting impossible images. Michael turned to run, but the hallway stretched, bending in unnatural angles. The walls pulsed, the shadows writhed, and then he saw them. Figures, crawling out of the mirrors. Each one was him, but not him. They lurched forward, arms outstretched, mouths gaping in silent screams. He ran, his feet barely touching the warped floor, as the walls closed in. The house was no longer a house. It was a living, breathing thing, and it wanted him to stay. A door appeared ahead, the only way out. He lunged for it, grasping the handle. Hands grabbed his ankles. He kicked, struggled, but they pulled him down. The floorboards split open, revealing nothing but blackness beneath. The hands dragged him inch by inch into the abyss. His screams vanished into the void, and then silence. Michael opened his eyes. He was standing in his bedroom. The air was still. The mirrors were gone. The shadows had retreated. Had it been a nightmare? Then his phone buzzed. A single message. Unknown number. You're not supposed to be here. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The room suddenly felt wrong. He turned slowly to face the mirror across the room. His reflection stood there. But it wasn't moving. It was watching. And then it smiled. Part 7. The House Awakens. The moment Michael saw the smile, his body locked in place. The air around him turned thick, pressing against his chest, suffocating him. The reflection lifted a hand, slowly, deliberately. Michael's own hand rose involuntarily, mirroring the movement. No, no, no. His breath came in sharp gasps. He tried to lower his arm, but his body refused to obey. Then the reflection's lips moved, and his own voice crawled out of the glass. It's time to switch places. Michael felt an invisible force pulling him toward the mirror. The world around him warped, his bedroom bending at unnatural angles. The walls cracked, the ceiling peeled away like burning paper, revealing nothing but blackness beyond. His feet left the floor. The mirror pulled him in. Michael screamed, thrashing against the force, but his body sank into the glass like water. The last thing he saw before being swallowed was his reflection stepping out into his world. Then, darkness. Michael hit the ground hard. He gasped, scrambling to his feet. But something was wrong. He was still in his bedroom. But it wasn't his bedroom. Everything looked the same, but off. The air felt too still. The shadows too dark. And then it hit him. The mirror was gone, and from outside the room, footsteps echoed down the hall. Michael turned toward the door. It slowly creaked open. A figure stood in the hallway. Michael squinted in the dim light. It was him. And then the whisper came right behind him. "You're not supposed to be here." Part 8. The final reflection. Michael's breath hitched as he stood in the twisted version of his bedroom. His reflection, or whatever had taken his place, watched from the hallway, grinning as if savoring the moment. Then it spoke. "You don't belong here." Michael's pulse pounded. "Where am I?" he rasped. The figure tilted its head, eyes gleaming with something inhuman. "Home. My home now." A sickening realization coiled around his chest. This place was not the real world. He had been pulled into something else, something designed to keep him here. And the other Michael? It had taken his place. The walls around him shivered, stretching and warping. This house was alive. The ceiling peeled back, revealing a swirling black void, pulsing like a beating heart. The floor rippled beneath his feet as whispers crawled out of the walls. Thousands of voices. They weren't whispers anymore. They were screams. Michael turned, panic surging. He had to get out. He bolted for the hallway, but the walls closed in, twisting the space into an impossible labyrinth. The doors vanished, replaced by endless mirrors, each reflecting a different version of himself. Some stood motionless, others clawed at the glass, their faces twisted in agony. And one stepped out. Michael stumbled back as a third version of himself emerged, its limbs jerking unnaturally. Its mouth hung open in a silent, endless scream. "You can't leave." Michael turned to run, but the floor gave out beneath him. He plunged into darkness. Michael landed hard, His head slammed against something cold and wet. He opened his eyes to find himself outside. Rain poured in thick sheets. The world around him blurred and wrong. The house stood before him, towering and distorted, its windows glowing like hungry eyes. But something was different. His reflection stood on the porch, watching, smiling. Michael's stomach twisted. The figure raised a hand and waved. Then it turned and walked inside. The door slammed shut. Michael ran to the house, pounding against the door, screaming, "Let me out!" No response. The windows darkened. Then his phone buzzed. With shaking hands, he pulled it from his pocket. Unknown number. Stay out. Michael's heart stopped. Then another message appeared. Unknown number. Don't come back. He looked up at the house, his own reflection now completely gone. The whispers were gone. The house was silent. Michael staggered back, rain soaking him to the bone. His mind raced, his breath ragged. The house had let him go, but something else had stayed behind. Something that looked just like him. And Michael wasn't sure who had really left. Michael never spoke about what happened that night. He moved to another city, avoided mirrors, and never walked alone after dark. But deep inside, he knew the truth. Somewhere in that house, his real self was still trapped. And every now and then, in the reflection of a window or a shadow at night, he saw himself smiling.